I'm Mark Berry, and it is my privilege to be the host of the Storyteller Showcase, where we bring you good stories by good storytellers. Well, we'll see about today because I'm going to share some stories with you today. I got started in storytelling when I was 3 years old. Well, story listening. My grandfather was actually a cowboy. And when I was 3 or 4 years old, I could sit by his knee and I could listen to him tell stories about being on the trail and driving the dogies and riding his pony all the way from the Pacific Northwest to St. Louis, where the railhead was. And it took months for them to make that journey, and it took quite a while for them to come back. And he did it over and over in his youth. He could tell me those stories and accompany himself on the harmonica, and I swear I could listen from dawn until dusk. He never repeated himself, and I was in awe. So later, as a grown-up, when I heard there was some storytelling going on, I went to listen, and I was fascinated. I got to know the storytellers and got to find out when they'd have their little gatherings at somebody's home or something, and I was there every chance I could be, and listening to all kinds of stories from all kinds of tellers. And after a certain number of those events, one time everybody was telling a story, and then after they were all done, they all looked at me. And I thought, oh, I'm supposed to bring something to the table. So I became a storyteller by default. I'd much rather listen because I know my stories, and I'd rather hear your stories. Speaking of which, if you'd like to be on the program, or if you'd like some more links to more of our shows, just email me. My email's on the credits, and I'd love to hear from you. So this first story is this is a series of traditional tales. Once upon a time, there was a samurai in the land of Japan. This was back before the land of Japan had been visited by ships from other lands. And the samurai, as you probably know, were raised from childhood and trained in the arts of focus and intention and martial arts. They were experts with weapons such as the bow and arrow, and especially the katana. The katana is the largest of the swords, and it's called their battle sword. Well, on this particular day, this particular samurai was walking down the road that everyone used. This samurai was a large man, especially by Japanese standards, and you could tell just by looking at him that he was well seasoned of many battles. And folks made way when he came down the road. And he stopped at a building and he rapped on the door very unceremoniously. And a little monk, when the door slid, there was a little monk, and the little monk bowed graciously and said, "How may I help you?" And the samurai said, "Monk, I want to learn the meaning and the difference between heaven and hell. Teach me." And the little monk looked up at this fierce warrior and he said, "Me? Teach you?" Well, even if I had time, I'm gardening, you see, which is very important. And if I had time to teach you, you're so full of yourself that I don't think there's room in there for much else. So, no. The samurai was enraged. He had never been spoken to so disrespectfully in his entire life. He had killed people for far less insults than this little monk. And you could tell his face was bright red, his neck was corded, his teeth were clenched, and he thought, I can get that little pipsqueak of a monk into 3 different pieces before the first piece hits the ground. And the monk drew his katana and he arched it in the air to decapitate the little monk. And as the sword was moving in the air, the little monk raised this finger and said, "This is hell." The samurai was startled right down to his toenails. He got it in an instant. And he also got that he was standing in front of the bravest man he'd ever met, even in all the battles. This man who risked his very life to give him the teaching he had so rudely asked for. He also realized that he was certainly standing in front of the wisest man in all of the land. And the samurai, being so moved, he sheathed his katana, which is never done. He sheathed his katana without drawing blood, and he began to bow to the little monk. Well, as you and I know, bowing is very common in Japan, but not like this bow. The samurai went to the lowest, most humble bow that he had ever performed in his life. Even that time he had been presented to the shogun, he had not bowed this lowly and this humbly. And just as our friend, the samurai, got to the lowest, most respectful part of the bow, the little monk raised that finger once again and said, "This is heaven." That's the story of the samurai and the little monk. This story takes place in the Old West. During the time that the railroad was being putting in, the railroad that was matching up, hooking up the continent from east to west. And my grandfather was kind of down on his luck and needed kind of any kind of work, and so he got to work on the railroad. They needed men. And he said, "We're going to put you to work as a spike pounder, and we're going to let you work next to old Gus. Old Gus has been here forever. He's the best spike pounder there ever was. So you'll learn from him." And there you go. And so Grandpa was learning from old Gus, and he was pounding the spikes and trying to get to where he'd hit them with the hammer. And he was getting a little better and a little better. And as they were working those long, hard days, on one particular day, a train came up the finished track, but not just any ordinary train. This was the most beautiful engine and the most beautiful one-carriage car that anybody had ever seen. Just elegant. And everybody looked. And one of the windows opened up in the car, and a head and a hand came out and said, "Hey, Gus, is that you?" And Gus, standing next to Grandpa, he said, "Hi, John. Yeah, it's me." From the train, "Let's have a talk during your break." "Yeah, let's do that." Went back to spike pounding, and my grandpa said, "Who's that?" And Gus said, "Oh, that's my buddy. He's the president of the railroad. We started working here together 20 years ago." Grandpa said to Gus, "Wait a minute. If you started working here 20 years ago, how come you're still pounding spikes and he's the president of the railroad?" And Gus said, "Well, that's very easy to explain. You see, when we started on that day, 20 years ago, I went to work for $1 a day. John went to work for the railroad." Once upon a time in the land of India, where the Tibetan Buddhist monks live in exile. Ever since the Chinese government took over Tibet back in the 1950s, they have been escaping and refugees and living in exile. And there was a place in India that was just jungle. You know how crowded India is. Well, there was an area where nobody could live. And they said, well, if you can manage there, you can live there. And so over the many years, many decades, the monks have carved out a living out of this jungle, and they found water and they found ways to make things work. And now, today, they have a monastic university where they can do their studies, and they have dormitories and quite a facility, and it's still located in the jungle. Well, on one particular day, this one young adult monk, he was walking from the dormitory to the university. Now, this young monk had been doing very well in his studies all the many years that he had been there, except for one thing. He had a heck of a time staying in the present moment, and his teachers and his brothers tried to help him and tried to encourage him and tried to give him helpful hints of how to do that, but he still had a hard time staying in this present moment. His mind would wander off to the future, and his mind would wander off to memories of the past most of the time. Well, on this day, like I said, the student monk is walking down the path, and as he's walking down the path, he gets a sense that there's something kind of following him, and he looks with his peripheral vision, and he notices something kind of orange, over there. And as he looks a little more with a little more peripheral vision, he realizes it's a tiger. It's a jungle tiger. And the tiger is pacing him perfectly as he walks through the jungle. And so the monk walks a little faster. And sure enough, the tiger paces him perfectly. So the monk walks even faster, and pretty soon the monk is running. The monk is just a blur of burgundy and gold robes just flying through the jungle. And the tiger is right at his heels. And the monk was just running so hard and so fast that before he knew it, he ran off the edge of the cliff. And there he was, flailing off the edge of the cliff, just like the cartoon characters you've seen. And as the monk was, the sleeve of his robe, the cuff of the sleeve of his robe caught on a little snag of a branch sticking out from that cliff face. And there he hung. When he looked up, sure enough, there were the toenails and the nose and the eyes of that tiger looking at him very hungrily. And then he heard something, and he looked down below, and oh my, there was a mountain cat, Puma, down there looking up at him, also looking very hungry. Right at that moment, the little monk's eyes fell on a little niche in the cliff face. And growing in that little niche in the cliff face were some wild strawberries. And he reached out and he plucked the most succulent, the ripest, the reddest, the most beautiful of those strawberries and plopped it in his mouth and said, mmm. That's the story of the monk and the strawberry. May you enjoy your moments. Once upon a time, this is a true story. Once upon a time, we had a president named Jimmy Carter, and he was fondly loved by everybody in the world, pretty much. And he was from a little town called Plains, Georgia, population 600, if you can believe it, the president of the United States. And when the president was in the White House, his mom, Lillian Carter, still lived in that little town of Plains, Georgia. And Plains, Georgia's population 600, and there were about 400 whites and 200 blacks, and nobody noticed the difference. They were just neighbors. They all just grew up together on peanut farms and plantations, farmers, basic folk. But now she's the mother of the president of the United States, and she doesn't exactly know how to play that role. She never had any training. One day she gets a phone call from a reporter that wants to interview her. And she thinks, well, I suppose I should say yes. So she does. And the reporter was coming from New York City all the way to Plains, Georgia, to interview Miss Lillian Carter. Well, on the day, when the day arrived, Miss Lillian Carter opens up the door, and there's this woman in her power suit with her shiny high heels and her briefcase, and Miss Carter, yes, introduces herself. Come on in, please. Come on in. Make yourself at home in our humble home, and let me get you some lemonade. Fresh squeezed, just made it. So Lillian Carter served. But before she could serve the lemonade, this reporter woman, she was all business. She wanted to get right down to it. And she said, Mrs. Carter, your son has said right into the television, your son has said, I've never told a lie. And I know that can't be true for a grown man to live his whole life and never tell a lie. So I'm here to get the scoop from you about when your son must have lied. And Lillian Carter thought for a moment and said, no, Jimmy, no, I don't think he ever told a lie. Oh, he's told some little white lies, but never really lied. And the reporter was all over that. What do you mean white lies? What do you mean there's kind of lies and other kind of lies? There's lying and there isn't lying. There's truth and there isn't truth. What do you mean? And Miss Lillian Carter said, well, remember a few minutes ago when I opened the door and I complimented you on your outfit and I said, please welcome, make yourself home, and I gave you some iced tea? She said, those were all little white lies. Miss Lillian Carter. I live in the Sierra foothills, and we got mountains, we got snow, we got winter. Well, one winter, there's a family that lives up up in the mountains on the edge of Tahoe National Forest. Beautiful. Lots of space, not many people, just animals and trees, and just beautiful. He's an old Native American elder. He lives there with his 2 grown sons on their place next to Tahoe National Forest. And it was getting on to winter. The weather had turned cold, and the old chief said to his sons, he said, it's going to be a cold winter, I can tell. We better put in some more stove wood. So the boys, dutiful, obedient boys, they got the truck, they went out, they found a felled tree, they bucked up that felled tree, they put those rounds in the pickup truck, they brought them back to the place, they split them, and they stacked them, and a whole long day's work, and they had 2 cords of wood stacked for the winter. About 2 weeks later, the old chief said to his sons, you know, it's going to be a long, cold winter. I think we're going to need another couple of cords of wood. So the boys, dutifully and obedient, take the truck out, find a fallen tree, buck it up, put the rounds in the truck, haul them back. It takes all day, several trips. And they split them and they stack them. Finally, got another couple of cords in for the winter. Good. Well, 2 weeks later, the old Indian says, boys, it's going to be a long, cold, hard winter. I think we need some more firewood. Okay. Well, the youngest of his sons had one of those square things with a screen on it that you hold in your hand, and he was just wondering if the old guy was really up to what was going on, or if they were doing all this work unnecessarily. So he called the local weather service, and they asked him where he was, and he told them, and they said, just a minute, and they connected him. And so he gets the forest ranger in Tahoe National Park, local, knows what's going on, right? So he asks him, is it going to be a long, cold, hard winter, do you think? Just a minute, let me check. A couple minutes later, the ranger comes back and says, oh, yes, my goodness, it's going to be a long, cold, hard winter. And the young man was curious. He says, well, where do you get your reports? Where do you get your information? And the ranger said, well, I have found something that is much more reliable than meteorologists and those scientific reports. He said, from my viewpoint here with my big telescope, I can see a homestead of an old Native American chief that lives right near Tahoe National Forest here, and I can see that they are stacking up the cordwood. So that's how I know it's going to be a long, cold, hard winter. I call this story One Wish. It's a traditional story. It takes place in Ireland long ago. It takes place during what the world has come to know as the Great Irish Potato Famine. Back then, they called it the blight. The blight was the disease that somehow killed all the crops and all the plants. Those people who had a couple of coins to rub together, they fled to the United States. That's why we have so many Irish policemen and firemen in the history of the east coast of the United States. But this family, they didn't have any coins to rub together. They didn't have a choice. They got to stay where they were. This was a family of a young farmer and his wife, and they were very poor, and the times were very hard, so much so that his parents came to live with them. They couldn't support 2 little farms anymore, so they were all trying to get together and living in the sod home that they had built on their land. And it had been so difficult that the farmer's mother had lost her eyesight due to malnutrition. One morning, the young farmer got up, and he had just had enough. He just had to do something. Desperate, he had to do something. And so when he got up and put on his hat and coat that morning, he took the axe from the chopping block, and he headed down the road. He was determined to get some food for his family or die trying. Well, as he went down the road, of course he didn't see any game because everyone else in the country was in the same situation. He kept going and going, and finally he was on the outskirts of the king's game preserve. Now, at those times in that place, if you were caught wandering on the king's game preserve, the guards could just lop your head off with their swords without even asking any questions. That was the rule of law. Knowing this, the farmer was so desperate to feed his family, he snuck onto the king's game preserve. And he stayed around the boulders and the bushes and the trees and was looking for something that he could possibly take home to feed his family. And over there he saw a bright light, a white light. And, well, he was puzzled, but he was also kind of mesmerized by it. And he was kind of drawn towards this light. And as he came closer, he saw it was a deer. It was a stag. And it was just glowing with this beautiful white light. And he kept approaching, almost magically drawn towards it. And when he got to a certain point, the stag turned his head and said, "I see you have come for my meat to feed your family. And that'd be okay. But first I need to tell you that I have it within my power to grant you one wish. Anything you can imagine. But one and only one wish." Well, imagine how the farmer felt, seeing this sight, hearing an animal speak in his language that he understood. I mean, he was flabbergasted. He was frozen in his tracks. And the stag said, "If you need to think about it, I'll be here tomorrow." Without saying a word, the farmer turned and snuck his way, hiding all the way back onto the road, and walked back to their little place. He was very pensive. He was very thoughtful, as you might be. And when he got there, he saw his father out in the field, and his father was digging around trying to find a turnip or whatever, but there was nothing, of course. And as he approached his father, he told his father of what he had just seen and what he had just encountered. And his father said, "My son, if there's any truth to what you're saying, you must go back and make your wish. You must wish for gold. For with enough gold, all of our problems will disappear." Then as he went towards their little house, he saw his mother out on the porch, blind, in the rocker. And he encountered his beloved mother and told her of what he had seen and heard. And his mother said, "My son, if there's any truth to what you're saying, you must wish for one and only one thing. You must wish for my eyesight to be returned. And then I could help your wife with the household chores, and I could help you and my husband in the fields." And then he went in, and there was his beloved bride, his beautiful wife, in there working, trying to clean up as if she had a meal to clean up after. And they sat down together, and he told her what he had just encountered. And she said, "My husband, if there's any truth to what you're saying, you must wish for the one and only thing that you and I have always wanted, a child of our own." Well, he went to bed that night very quietly, got up the next morning very quietly, full of thoughts. I wonder what he was thinking. I wonder what he might wish for. I wonder what you might wish for in that situation. Well, after a quiet morning, he put on his hat and coat, but this time he didn't take the axe. He went on down that road again. You know where he was going. Finally, when he made it down the road, he snuck onto the king's game preserve, and again he was successful in not being detected. And as he snuck, he saw the white stag, just as it promised, and he approached, and as he got closer, the white stag looked at him without the axe and said, "Oh, I see you have come for your one wish. What will it be?" Well, the young farmer thought very carefully, forming his words very carefully. And he said, "This is my one wish. I wish for my mother to see clearly my wife's and my happy, healthy baby being rocked in its huge, solid gold cradle." That's the one wish.